Clint Eastwood did not explain himself. That was understood by everyone who worked with him and by most people who had paid attention to his career across 4 decades of making films. He was not a man who narrated his interior process. He did not hold press conferences about his opinions. He did not grant interviews in which he elaborated on what he found moving or what he found hollow, what he respected or what left him cold. He moved through the world with the particular economy of a man who had decided, at some point early in his life, that words were most powerful when used sparingly, and that the surest sign of a weak position was the need to defend it extensively. Elaboration in Eastwood's vocabulary was a form of insecurity. The thing itself should be sufficient. If it wasn't, adding words around it didn't make it sufficient. It only made the insufficiency more visible. This extended to music, which was the other serious thing in his life alongside filmmaking. He played jazz piano with genuine ability, not as a hobby but as a practice, something he returned to regularly and treated with the same seriousness he brought to everything else he cared about. He had composed scores for his own films. He had a relationship with sound that was as deep and as carefully developed as his relationship with image, both organized around the same core aesthetic: restraint as discipline, silence as material, economy as the highest form of craft. He believed that what you left out of a piece of music was as important as what you put in. He believed this not as a philosophy, but as a working principle, the way a carpenter believes in the specific properties of wood, not theoretically, but because he had tested it thousands of times and found it true. He had spent 40 years building a body of work, in film and in music both, that embodied these beliefs without ever stating them directly. The work was the statement. That was the point. He was not, in 1992, someone who followed rock radio. This was not a position or a prejudice. It was simply a fact about where his attention lived and what it had been organized around for decades. What happened on the set of A Perfect World in the spring of 1992 was not planned by anyone involved. It was not significant in any way that anyone on set would have identified at the time, but it changed something, quietly, in a way that took 16 years to become fully visible. The set was in Texas, the flat open country between Austin and nowhere in particular. The kind of landscape that looks like it was constructed specifically to make people feel the weight of the sky above them. It was a large production, Eastwood directing and starring, Kevin Costner across from him, the full machinery of a major studio film operating around them at all times. Between setups, there were the long stretches of waiting that are the actual texture of filmmaking, the hours that don't appear on screen, during which everyone finds their own way to be present without being in the way. Eastwood used those stretches to think, not visibly. He didn't pace or talk through problems. He sat in his director's chair and processed whatever needed processing, looking at the landscape or at nothing in particular, in a state that people who knew him recognized as productive rather than idle. A young production assistant had been listening to Nevermind on a Walkman for most of that week. The record had been out for several months. It had already become something that exceeded the usual boundaries of music conversation. Something cultural, something generational, something that people were describing in terms that reached beyond charts and radio play into the language of rupture and change. He didn't intend to hand it to Eastwood. It happened the way things happen on long shoots, through the casual proximity of people spending too many hours together in limited space. The Walkman was out. Eastwood was nearby. Someone made a comment. The assistant offered the headphones the way young people offer things to older people when they want to share something they're excited about. Not really expecting the offer to be taken seriously, Eastwood accepted. He sat in his director's chair, put on the headphones, and pressed play. He listened without visible reaction for the length of one full song. The assistant watched him from a respectful distance, trying to read a face that had been professionally unreadable for 4 decades. When the song ended, Eastwood took off the headphones. He handed back the Walkman. Then he said, "Can you get me a copy of this?" The assistant got him a copy, a cassette, which was still the standard portable format in 1992. He left it with Eastwood's personal items at the end of the day and thought nothing more about it, or rather, thought about it the way young people think about moments with significant people, storing it as a data point without yet knowing what it was data for. Eastwood didn't mention the cassette again during production. He didn't bring it up in conversation. didn't reference the band, didn't make any gesture that would have indicated the music had landed somewhere specific. He was directing a film. The film required all available attention. The cassette was still in his possession when production wrapped. The assistant noticed, when clearing out the space, that it hadn't been left behind. He said nothing. It was a cassette tape. People kept or discarded cassette tapes based on criteria that were entirely their own. But he remembered it. He remembered the moment of the headphones and the song playing and the expression on Eastwood's face, which had not been the polite expression of a man tolerating something to be agreeable. It had been the focused expression of a man hearing something that required his attention. Those were different things. On Eastwood's face, the difference was legible to anyone who knew how to read it, which the assistant had by then spent enough time on set to do. The years passed. The cassette was not discussed publicly by anyone. Eastwood continued making films at the rate and with the consistency of someone for whom the work was both profession and oxygen. He continued playing piano. He continued composing. His aesthetic remained what it had always been: spare, precise, deeply suspicious of anything that used volume or spectacle to substitute for substance. Kurt Cobain died in April 1994. Eastwood was filming The Bridges of Madison County. He received the news the way people in the middle of productions received news from outside, acknowledging it, placing it somewhere, and continuing to work because the work doesn't stop for things that happen outside the frame. He said nothing public about it. He said nothing public about Nirvana or Kurt Cobain for 14 years. In 2008, Eastwood was doing press for Changeling, a film he had directed that had opened to significant critical attention. The interviews were long and ranged across his career. The westerns, the Dirty Harry years, the pivot to directing full-time, the late period that many critics considered his richest work. In one of these interviews, conducted by a film critic who had followed his career for decades and had developed a sense of which questions produced genuine answers rather than managed ones, the conversation turned to influence. The critic asked about music, specifically about whether there were musicians whose approach to their craft had affected how Eastwood thought about filmmaking, about silence, about economy, about the relationship between what you show and what you withhold. Eastwood mentioned Miles Davis, which was expected. He mentioned a few jazz pianists whose names the critic noted carefully. He mentioned the silence in certain Ennio Morricone scores. The way Morricone used space not as rest, but as tension, as the held breath before something arrives. This too was expected, given what everyone knew about Eastwood's relationship with Leone's films and with Morricone's scores for them. Then he mentioned Kurt Cobain. The critic, who had not expected this, waited. There was a quality in how he used space, Eastwood said. Most rock music fills every available inch. It's afraid of empty space. He wasn't afraid of it. The quiet parts of his songs weren't transitional. They were load-bearing. They were doing as much work as the loud parts, maybe more. He paused in the way he paused when he was finishing a thought rather than abandoning one. That's a sophisticated understanding of how sound works. It doesn't usually come with a lot of technical training behind it. Sometimes it just comes from understanding, intuitively, that what you don't put in front of people is as important as what you do. Sometimes that understanding arrives without anyone teaching it. The critic asked how he had come to listen to Cobain's music. "Someone handed me a cassette on a set years ago," Eastwood said. "I listened to it once. I kept it." The critic asked if he still had it. Eastwood looked at him with the expression he used when a question had a simple answer that the questioner already knew. "Yes," he said. That was the end of that portion of the interview. The critic moved on. The exchange appeared in the published piece as a brief paragraph among many, notable to the people who read it carefully, invisible to the people scanning for other things. It was not the headline. It was not treated as a revelation. It was simply one moment in a long conversation about the principles that had organized a significant career. But the people who found it and held it knew what it was. What Eastwood had identified, the load-bearing quality of the quiet in Cobain's music, was something that critics had circled around without quite landing on in the years of writing about Nirvana. The usual frameworks were about rawness, about authenticity, about the grunge generations, relationship with alienation. The technical observation that the silences in the music were structural rather than transitional, that the space was doing work, the same way the space in a Sergio Leone frame was doing work, that was a different kind of observation. It came from somewhere specific. It came from a man who had spent 40 years making films in which what you didn't show was as carefully considered as what you did, in which the camera stayed on a face without cutting because the face was doing something that editing would interrupt, in which a landscape was held on screen until the silence of it accumulated into meaning, in which the score used the absence of music as precisely as it used the presence of it. That man had put on a pair of headphones in a director's chair in Texas in 1992 and heard a 24-year-old from Aberdeen doing something structurally similar with an entirely different set of materials. He had asked for a copy. He had kept it for 16 years. He had mentioned it once in 2008 to a film critic who had been following his career long enough to know a real answer when it appeared in the middle of an interview full of careful ones. The production assistant heard about the 2008 interview from someone who had been keeping track of Eastwood's press in a professional capacity. He was older by then, working in a different part of the industry, with enough distance from the 1992 set to see that day clearly rather than through the distortion of proximity and youth. He remembered the headphones. He remembered the expression on Eastwood's face during the song. Not the polite expression of a man tolerating something out of goodwill toward a young assistant, but the focused expression of someone hearing something that required his attention. He remembered watching from a careful distance and registering the difference between those two things without yet having the language to name it. He remembered the cassette not being left behind when the production wrapped. He had wondered in the years between 1992 and 2008 whether any of it had meant anything. Film sets were full of small gestures that didn't mean anything. Someone keeping a cassette tape didn't necessarily signify more than the fact that they hadn't gotten around to throwing it away. He had told the story occasionally to people he trusted, as one of those anecdotes from early career that stays with you without your being certain why. The kind of story you tell partly to find out what it means by watching how other people respond to it. The 2008 interview answered the question he had been carrying for 16 years. It had meant something, not something casual or polite, something specific, the specific meaning that things acquire when Clint Eastwood keeps them for 16 years and then mentions them once in the middle of a conversation about the organizing principles of his entire working life, in the same breath as Miles Davis and Ennio Morricone. That was not a polite gesture toward a young assistant. That was a record of something that had landed. He had put on a pair of headphones in a director's chair in Texas in 1992 and heard a 24-year-old from Aberdeen working intuitively and without formal training from the same understanding of negative space that had organized Eastwood's entire aesthetic. He had asked for a copy. He had listened once. He had kept it for 16 years without mentioning it. He mentioned it once, to one interviewer in 2008, in a paragraph that appeared near the middle of a long piece that most readers moved through without stopping. Some things take a long time to surface. Some recognitions travel slowly from the moment they occur to the moment they become sayable. Some cassette tapes sit in a drawer for 16 years doing exactly the work that the music on them always did, quietly without announcement in the dark. He listened once. He never gave it back. That was the whole story. That was enough. The quiet parts weren't transitional. They were load-bearing. That's a sophisticated understanding of how sound works. Clint Eastwood, press interview, 2008.